It's a strange thing to be erased, a quiet, bloodless kind of vanishing. I wonder if you've ever felt it, that chilling realization that your entire existence has been neatly edited out of the frame. On my 68th birthday, they threw me a party, and I was the only guest. The house, this grand aspen lodge David had insisted on, was cavernous with silence. I sat in the formal dining room, at the head of a table that could seat 20, with a single vanilla cupcake I'd bought myself from the market. The flame on its solitary candle danced, a tiny, defiant flicker of life in the vast, gathering dark. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of ghosts, the echo of David's booming laugh, the memory of our son Leo's tiny hands gripping the edge of this very table. Now, the silence was just a wait. At precisely 7 o'clock, my phone, resting beside my untouched cupcake, lit up. A notification. I knew what it would be. I always did. My thumb hovered over the Instagram icon, a moment of cowardly hesitation. I opened it, and there they were. The video was drenched in the golden light of a setting sun. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, her blonde hair whipping in the breeze, held up a flute of champagne. My son Leo stood beside her, his arm draped possessively around her waist, a smile on his face I hadn't seen directed at me in years. And between them, my granddaughter Chloe, all of 16, mimicked their pose with a glass of sparkling cider. They were on a yacht, the pristine white deck gleaming, the water of the marina a deep, shimmering blue behind them. The sound was crystal clear, the clink of their glasses, Jessica's bright, artificial laugh, Leo's deeper murmur. A perfect portrait of happiness. Then I read the caption, typed out in a clean, cheerful font beneath the video. Celebrating life's biggest wins. #family first. My breath didn't catch. My heart didn't pound. It just stopped. A cold, heavy stillness spread through my chest, a paralysis of the soul. Family first. The words hung there, a monument to their hypocrisy. And then, the final, exquisite twist of the knife, the location tag, Aspen Marina. Less than a mile from this house. I could have walked there. They hadn't even had the decency to leave town. They were celebrating their life, their family, within earshot of the woman they had left behind. I stared at the screen until it went dark, and in the black reflective surface, I saw my own face, pale and indistinct, a ghost at her own feast. The silence that followed the video was different. It was heavier, colder. It was in that profound quiet that the door to the dining room swung open. Jessica stood there, framed in the doorway. She didn't knock. She never did. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and leggings, looking as if she'd just stepped out of a magazine. Her smile was a thin, perfect line. "Mia," she said, her voice as smooth as venom and just as cold. She walked towards me, her expensive boots making no sound on the thick Persian rug. She didn't look at the cupcake. She didn't acknowledge the date. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept the room as if assessing its value, then landed on me. "We need this room." It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. "And your bedroom." My son, Leo, appeared behind her, a tall, handsome shadow. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze was fixed on the polished tips of his Italian leather shoes, the ones Jessica had bought him for Christmas. He was a silent accomplice, his stillness a resounding vote in her favor. Jessica continued, her voice never wavering from its placid, condescending tone. "Chloe's social media is really taking off. She needs a proper space, a real studio for her streaming setup. Your room has the best natural light." She gestured vaguely towards the wing of the house where I had slept for 40 years, the room where I had woken up next to my husband, the room where I had wept after he was gone. My room. I said nothing. My voice was a forgotten tool, rusted from disuse. "We've cleared a space for you in the garage," she announced, as if offering me a generous gift. "Don't worry," she added, seeing some flicker of something on my face. It couldn't have been protest. I had no fight left in me. It's insulated. She smiled then. It was a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth, a flash of triumph. "You won't be a bother there." A bother. That's what I was. A piece of inconvenient, aging furniture. Leo shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the leather of his shoes sighing softly. the only sound he made in my defense. Jessica turned and walked out, expecting me to follow, and I did, like a lamb. Leo stood aside to let me pass, his head still bowed. I walked past him, close enough to smell his cologne, the same expensive kind David used to wear. It was a cruel, phantom scent of a love that no longer existed. He fell into step behind me, a silent guard escorting a prisoner to her cell. We walked through the house that was no longer mine. Past the photos on the wall, me and David on our wedding day, a young Leo on a tricycle, a family that existed only in silver frames. The walk to the garage was a long, humiliating procession. The door connecting it to the house opened into a sudden, shocking cold. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline, damp concrete, and dust. In the corner, next to a stack of old tires and boxes ominously labeled David's Things, was a narrow, metal frame cot. It was made up with a thin blanket and a single, flat pillow. A bare bulb hanging from a cord in the ceiling cast a harsh, lonely light on my new home. Jessica was waiting, her arms crossed, tapping her foot. "There," she said, her gesture encompassing the cot and the cold, empty space. "All settled." She and Leo turned to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back at me, standing alone under the bare bulb. "Oh, and Mia? The main door to the garage locks from the outside automatically, just so you know, for security." Then she closed the door. The heavy click of the lock echoed in the concrete box, and I was alone, in the cold, in the dark, on my 68th birthday, utterly and completely erased. My name is Mia. Before I was David's wife, before I was Leo's mother, I was simply Mia, and Mia was an art curator. My world wasn't a sprawling Aspen estate overlooking snow-dusted peaks. It was a quiet, respected gallery in Boston, nestled on a street paved with history. It smelled of old paper, linseed oil, and the faint, clean scent of rain on concrete. My passion wasn't in hosting galas for men in expensive suits, but in discovering the raw, unspoken truth in a brushstroke, the soul of an artist laid bare on canvas. I lived in a world of color, of texture, of light and shadow. I understood that a painting wasn't just an image, it was a conversation, a moment of a life captured and held still for eternity. I specialized in the abstract expressionists, the masters of chaos and control. I loved the violent energy of a Pollock, the profound, meditative depth of a Rothko. I saw in their work a mirror of the human heart, complex, layered, often turbulent beneath a composed surface. I built a name for myself, not with noise, but with a quiet, confident eye. I could walk into a cluttered studio and find the one piece that hummed with genius. I gave artists their first shows, wrote essays that helped the world see what I saw. My career was my own masterpiece, one I was painting with deliberate, loving strokes. Then I met David. He wasn't an artist, but he collected them, or rather, he collected their success. He walked into my gallery one crisp autumn afternoon, a whirlwind of charisma and ambition. He didn't look at the art with his soul. He looked at it with an investor's ledger. He saw assets, not beauty. But he saw me. He told me I had an uncommon eye, not just for art, but for quality, for potential. He spoke of building an empire, not of brick and mortar, but of influence and legacy. He saw Aspen not as a town, but as a stage, and he wanted me to be his set designer, his producer, the silent architect of his grand performance. I fell in love not with his money, but with the sheer force of his vision. It was intoxicating. He painted a future for us that was as vast and compelling as a landscape by Bierstadt. A life of purpose, he called it. A partnership. He made me feel that my talent, my eye, was the missing ingredient to his success. And so, I made a choice. I remember the last day at my gallery. I stood in the empty space, the walls bare, echoing with the ghosts of exhibitions past. I packed away my books, my notes, my independence. I told myself I wasn't giving anything up. I was simply transferring my skills to a grander canvas, our life together. Our home in Aspen became my new gallery. I curated every inch of it. The furniture, the sculptures in the garden, the precise shade of white on the walls designed to catch the mountain light. I orchestrated the dinner parties, curating guest lists like an exhibition, placing people together to create sparks of conversation and commerce. I was the one who remembered the names of their children, their favorite wine, the subtle cues of their ambitions and insecurities. David was the star, the sun around which everything orbomed, but I was the gravity, the invisible force that held it all in perfect, elegant alignment. I was the architect of the silence in which his booming voice could be best heard. I helped paint the masterpiece of his life, but as the years went on, I realized my signature was written in invisible ink. When David died 2 years ago, the silence he left behind was different. It wasn't the peaceful, structured silence I had so carefully designed. It was a hollow, cavernous void. A sudden, massive heart attack had taken him overnight. The sun had simply winked out. In the initial shock, I thought my son, Leo, would be my comfort, the legacy of our love made real. He had grown up in the glow of his father's world, a prince in a kingdom I had helped build. I believed the foundation I had laid, the values of family and loyalty I had embodied, would now be the bedrock that supported us both. For a few weeks, he held my hand. He spoke in hushed, respectful tones. But then Jessica, his wife, began to subtly assert her presence. She had always been a peripheral figure in my carefully curated world, a sharp-edged, modern piece that never quite fit with the classic elegance of our lives. But now, with David gone, she stepped into the center of the room. The transition was insidious. At first, it was just helping out. She'd sort through David's papers, her brow furrowed in concentration, murmuring about complexities I wouldn't understand. Leo would watch her, a look of admiration on his face, as if she were a surgeon performing a delicate operation. Slowly, I began to feel like a ghost in my own home. The life I had built, piece by piece, was being dismantled around me. The vibrant conversations at the dinner table were replaced by the incessant tapping of their phones. The warmth of shared memories was chilled by their talk of market trends and investment portfolios. I became a relic, a piece of old furniture they were no longer sure what to do with. A living artifact from a bygone era, collecting dust in a corner. They moved through the rooms I had designed with an air of ownership, their voices echoing in the grand spaces where David's had once commanded respect. I was the curator of a gallery that was no longer mine, waiting for the day they would finally decide to put me in storage. I was financially dependent, or so they made me believe. In the whirlwind of grief after David's passing, Jessica had stepped in to manage the estate. With her paralegal background, she spoke a language of trusts and probate courts that felt alien and intimidating. She presented stacks of documents with a practiced, reassuring smile. "It's all so complicated, Mia," she'd say, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "The last thing you need is to worry about all this." Leo would nod in agreement, his gaze distant. "Jess knows what she's doing, Mom. Just let her handle it." And so I did. I signed where she told me to sign, trusting that my son, my own flesh and blood, had my best interests at heart. It was the greatest mistake of my life. The entire architecture of David's and my financial world, a structure I had helped maintain through social grace and silent support, was now controlled by her. She became the gatekeeper to my own life. The grand illusion of my gilded cage became starkly, brutally real. The shift was subtle at first. Bills were paid, the lights stayed on. But my access, my agency, was systematically severed. It culminated one afternoon in the kitchen, the sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating the cold, hard expression on Jessica's face. She placed a small plastic card on the polished marble countertop. It was a sterile, impersonal blue, a prepaid debit card. "Here you go, Mia," she said, her tone bright and condescending, as if she were giving a treat to a child. "We've set this up for you for your weekly expenses. Groceries, little things you might need." I stared at the card. It felt flimsy and insulting in the grand, solid kitchen I had designed. "A prepaid card? Jessica, I don't understand. I've always just used the joint account." Her smile tightened. "Oh, we've had to close that for probate reasons. It's all part of consolidating the estate. This is much safer for you. We'll just top it up every Monday morning. It's a clean, simple system." Leo, who had been scrolling on his phone by the island, looked up. It's a good idea, Mom. There are so many scams out there targeting seniors. This way, no one can take advantage of you. The irony was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. They stood there, my son and his wife, framing this profound act of control as an act of protection. They were building the walls of my prison and calling it a fortress. The allowance was just enough. Enough for a modest grocery run at the local market, where I had once been greeted by name as Mrs. Thorne, a pillar of the community. Now I found myself anxiously calculating the cost of every item, the quiet humiliation of a budget hanging over the simple act of buying food. Enough for a prescription from the pharmacy, but not enough for the expensive face cream I'd used for 30 years. Enough for a coffee, but not enough to take a friend to lunch. It was a meticulously calculated sum, designed to keep me alive, but not to let me live. It certainly wasn't enough for a bus ticket, let alone a flight. It wasn't enough for an escape. The humiliation became a weekly ritual. I'd go to the checkout, my heart pounding, and pray the card wouldn't be declined. One time, I had dared to buy a small bouquet of dahlias, my favorite flower, a simple burst of joy. The total was a few dollars over. The cashier, a young girl with kind eyes, looked at me with pity as the machine beeped its denial. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Insufficient funds." The people in line behind me shifted impatiently. I felt my face burn with shame. I had to ask her to remove the flowers. I walked out of the store empty-handed, the ghost of their vibrant color mocking me. I, who had once managed household budgets that could fund a small corporation, could not afford a $10 bouquet of flowers. Jessica was the warden, and the debit card was her bars. She'd ask for receipts, scrutinizing them under the guise of bookkeeping. "Oh, organic blueberries, Mia. A little pricey, don't you think?" She'd comment lightly, the judgment clear in her voice. "We have to be mindful of the estate's resources until everything is settled." The estate. It was no longer our family's wealth. It was an abstract entity she alone commanded. The line she used, the one that echoed in my head during long, sleepless nights, was always the same. She'd pat my hand, her touch cold despite the warmth of her smile. "It's for your own good, Mia," she'd coo. "We just don't want you getting scammed." And in those moments, I would look from her perfectly manicured nails to my son's averted eyes, and the truth would settle in my soul like a layer of cold, heavy silt. The scam wasn't out there in the world, waiting to pounce on a vulnerable old woman. The scam was already inside the house. The scam was my family. The architect of silence had become its first prisoner. My world had shrunk to the four walls of the garage, but the cruelty I was learning was boundless. It found new ways to seep through the cracks, to colonize every moment of silence. It began with a gift, as the most insidious poisons often do. Jessica presented it to me one afternoon, a sleek black tablet in a pristine white box. She held it out with two hands, her acrylic nails clicking against the cardboard. "For you, Mia," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness so synthetic it made my teeth ache. "So you can stay connected. We don't want you feeling lonely out here." Chloe, my granddaughter, stood beside her, phone already in her hand, filming. A tight, knowing smile played on her lips. Leo was absent. He was always absent for these carefully staged moments of benevolence. "It's an iPad," Chloe chirped, stepping closer. "Everyone has one, Grandma. It's easy." I took the box. It felt cold and heavy, a slate on which my next humiliation would be written. I had never been good with technology. David had always handled it, and after he was gone, the world of screens and apps had accelerated past me. I preferred the weight of a book, the texture of a canvas. "Go on, open it," Jessica urged, her eyes flicking to Chloe's phone and back to me. It was a performance. I was the main attraction, and the price of admission was my dignity. I fumbled with the plastic wrapping, my arthritic fingers stiff and uncooperative. The cellophane crinkled loudly in the quiet garage. Finally, I slid the top off the box. The glass screen stared up at me, a black, vacant eye. Chloe zoomed in. "Just press the button on the side to turn it on," she instructed, her voice a little too loud, a little too slow, as if she were speaking to a toddler. I found the small button and pressed it. The screen flared to life with a bright white apple. I flinched. "See? You did it," Jessica exclaimed with false enthusiasm. "Now just swipe to open." I placed my thumb on the glass and tried to push it across. Nothing happened. I tried again, pressing harder. A little box appeared asking for a password I didn't have. "No, Grandma." "Swipe," Chloe corrected, a giggle escaping her lips. "Like this." She mimed the motion in the air, a flick of the wrist. I tried to copy it. My fingers stuttered across the screen. The home screen, full of colorful icons, finally appeared. I had no idea what any of them meant. They looked like a foreign language. "Let's try FaceTime," Jessica suggested, her smile widening. "You can call us when you're in here. Chloe, show her." Chloe leaned over, her perfume cloying and sweet. She tapped the screen a few times, her movements a dizzying blur. My own face, tired and confused, suddenly stared back at me from the screen. The angle was unflattering, highlighting the deep lines around my mouth, the slight tremble in my hand holding the device. "Okay, now you try to find the TikTok app," Chloe said, pointing to a black square with a musical note. "It's for videos. It's fun." I stared at my own magnified, distorted face. I felt a wave of nausea. I didn't want to see myself like this, a caricature of old age. I didn't want this cold, unblinking eye in my sanctuary of solitude. I think I need my glasses," I stammered, a weak excuse. "Oh, Grandma," Chloe sighed, the feigned patience wearing thin. She tapped the screen again, and a video of a dancing cat appeared. The music was loud and jarring. I just sat there, holding the device, as they taught me. Every confused tap, every hesitant question, every moment of fumbling was being recorded by the phone in Chloe's hand. I could feel the lens on me, not just of her phone, but of the unseen audience she was performing for. I was no longer a person. I was content. Later that evening, the true purpose of the gift was revealed. I was sitting on my cot, eating the dinner they had left for me on a tray by the door. It was the leftovers from their meal. A few forkfuls of risotto, cold and clumpy, in a plastic container with a plastic fork. From the main house, through the connecting door, I could hear them. They were at the dining table, the real dining table. I could hear the clink of silverware on porcelain, the murmur of their conversation, and then a sudden burst of laughter. It was Chloe's high-pitched shriek, followed by Jessica's throaty chuckle. The sound was sharp, cruel. It was followed by the tinny audio I recognized from the video Chloe had taken earlier. My own voice, hesitant and thin. How do I swipe?" Then, more laughter. Curiosity, a masochistic, painful urge, pulled me to my feet. I crept to the door and pressed my ear against the wood. "Oh my God, look at the comments," Chloe said, her voice giddy. "My boomer grandma tries to use an iPad. It's already got like 10,000 views. LOL, she's so old," Jessica read aloud, and then she laughed so hard she snorted. "Someone get this woman a jitterbug phone. That's hilarious. Put her in a home already." "Ouch, savage," Chloe cackled. I leaned my forehead against the cold door, my eyes squeezed shut. Each word was a physical blow. They were sitting there, in the warm, well-lit dining room that used to be mine, feasting on my humiliation. I was the evening's entertainment. The video was played again, my confused voice echoing in the home I had built. I could picture them perfectly, Jessica with her wine glass, Leo staring at his plate, and Chloe, her face lit by the glow of her phone, scrolling through the mockery of strangers. I backed away from the door, my breath catching in my throat. I looked at the iPad, which lay dark on the small table beside my cot. It wasn't a gift. It was a weapon. A tool to document my decay, to package my irrelevance for public consumption. I slid it back into its box and pushed it under the cot, as if burying a small coffin. I ate the rest of my cold risotto in the dark, the plastic fork scraping against the container, the sound of their laughter a symphony of cruelty that played on a loop in my head. That night, the cold began in earnest. The garage had never been warm. It was a space designed for cars and forgotten furniture, not for a human being. But there had always been a low, steady hum from the vents, a trickle of warmth from the house's main furnace that kept the worst of the aspen chill at bay. Tonight, there was only silence, a deep, penetrating silence that was colder than any sound. I lay on the cot, wrapped in the 2 thin blankets they had given me, my own fine wool and cashmere blankets having been packed away in storage. The cold seeped up from the concrete floor, through the thin mattress, and into my bones. It was a damp, gnawing cold that made my joints ache with a deep, pulsing rhythm. I could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the loose pane of glass in the small window. I pulled the blankets tighter, tucking them under my chin, my breath pluming in the air before my face. I could hear them upstairs. The faint, bass-heavy thump of a television show, and then that same sound again, Jessica's sharp, barking laugh. They were warm, they were comfortable, and they were in control. I remembered Jessica tapping on her phone earlier in the day, showing Chloe a new app. "It controls the whole house," she had boasted. "Lights, security, even the thermostat in every zone." Every zone. The garage was a zone. It wasn't neglect. Neglect is passive. This was active. This was a decision. I imagined her, lying in her warm bed, scrolling through her phone. Perhaps she looked at the TikTok comments one last time before tapping the screen, a small, simple gesture that plunged my world into a state of Arctic misery. It was a calculated act, a nightly reminder of my powerlessness. They were turning down the dial on my existence bit by bit, to see how much I could endure before I simply faded away. I got up and put on the sweater I had worn that day over my thin pajamas. Then I added a cardigan on top of that. I lay back down, but the cold was relentless. It was an oppressive presence in the room, a physical weight. I lay there for hours, shivering, listening to the house settle around me. I listened for the furnace to click on, a sound I used to take for granted, but it never came. My world was the cot, the concrete, and the cold. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of the spirit, designed to make me feel as old and useless as the broken lawn furniture stacked in the corner. It was designed to break me. The next morning, I rose stiffly, my back and hips screaming in protest. The air was still frigid. I made my way into the house, seeking the warmth of the kitchen, like a desert wanderer seeks an oasis. The air inside was blessedly warm, smelling of freshly brewed coffee and something toasting. Jessica and Leo were at the quartz island, the one David and I had picked out together. She was scrolling through her phone, a half-eaten avocado toast on a plate before her. Leo was staring into his coffee mug, his shoulders hunched. A space had been left for Chloe, but there was no place set for me. There never was. I was expected to get my own things from the back of the cupboard, the mismatched mug, the chipped plate, and eat standing by the counter, if I ate in there at all. I stood in the doorway, waiting to be acknowledged. A moment passed, then another. They knew I was there. I could see my reflection in the polished chrome of the refrigerator, a hunched, gray figure in the periphery, an afterthought. Finally, Jessica spoke, not to me, but to Leo, her voice loud and clear, as if I were a piece of furniture, incapable of hearing. "God, she smells of mothballs," she complained, wrinkling her nose in disgust. "The whole garage must be full of them. We're going to have to air it out for a week before the realtor comes." My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I was wearing the cardigan that had been stored in my own closet, in my own bedroom, just a few weeks ago. The scent was of cedar and lavender, the sachets I had made myself years ago. It was the scent of my life before this. Leo didn't look up from his coffee. He just grunted in response. "I spoke to that lawyer again," Jessica continued, her tone shifting to one of brisk business. "The one for David's trust. He's so stuffy, but he confirmed it again. Soon. That's all he'll ever say. How soon is soon, Leo? The market in the Upper Valley is perfect right now. I saw a place in Starwood that would be an amazing flip, but we need the capital from this sale." She gestured vaguely around the kitchen, my kitchen, as if it were already a sold commodity. Leo finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine in the refrigerator's reflection for a fraction of a second before darting away. There was no defiance in them, no shame, only a deep, weary emptiness. "Soon, honey," he said, his voice flat. the lawyer said soon. He was agreeing with her. He was complicit in this discussion of my eventual and hopefully speedy demise. They were talking about my death, my inheritance, the liquidation of my life, as casually as they discussed the weather. I was not a mother. I was a roadblock. I was not a person. I was a line item in their financial plan, an obstacle between them and a mansion in Starwood. I turned without a word and walked back to the cold garage. I didn't get a cup of coffee. I didn't get any toast. The hunger in my stomach was nothing compared to the hollow ache in my chest. They hadn't just moved me out of my room. They had moved me out of their lives, out of their consciousness. I was an invisible woman, a ghost haunting the edges of my own home, waiting for the final exorcism of a real estate transaction. As I closed the door behind me, I heard Chloe come into the kitchen, her bright voice asking what was for breakfast, and the sound of their family life resuming, seamlessly, as if I had never been there at all. The days had blurred into a gray, featureless landscape of cold and quiet. Each morning, the concrete floor of the garage seeped a damp chill through the thin soles of my slippers, a physical reminder of my demotion. The world had shrunk to these four walls, the scent of gasoline and dust my constant companions. Hope was a foreign country I no longer had a passport for. It was a Tuesday, I think. The quality of the light filtering through the grimy high window had the flat, indifferent feel of a Tuesday morning. That was when the sound came. A sharp, authoritative rap, not on the grand front door of the house, but on the flimsy side door of the garage, my door. I froze, my hand hovering over a dusty box of David's old tax records I'd been tasked with sorting. No one ever came to this door. Visitors were for the main house, for the real family. Deliveries were left on the porch. This was different. The knock came again, firmer this time, patient. I pulled my threadbare cardigan tighter around my shoulders, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. I shuffled to the door, my movements stiff from the cold, and pulled it open a crack. A man stood there, silhouetted against the bright aspen morning. He was tall, dressed in a gray suit so perfectly tailored, it seemed sculpted from smoke and steel. His hair was silver at the temples, his face a mask of polite neutrality, but his eyes were what held me. They were sharp, intelligent, and held a flicker of something I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Professional respect, mingled with a carefully controlled pity. He didn't look at me as if I were a piece of forgotten furniture. He looked at me as if I were a person. "Mrs. Mia Thompson?" he asked. His voice was a calm, low baritone that cut through the garage's stale air. I could only nod, my own voice a forgotten tool. "My name is Arthur Harrison," he said, extending a hand, not for a handshake, but to present a business card. "I was your husband David's personal attorney. I am here to initiate the annual review as stipulated by the Legacy Trust." The words Legacy Trust hung in the air, unfamiliar and heavy. David had handled everything, a whirlwind of papers and phone calls that I was gently but firmly excluded from. He called it protecting me from the stress. Now I knew it was just another form of control. Before I could process his statement, the door to the main house kitchen, the one connecting my world to theirs, flew open. Jessica stood there, wiping her hands on a dish towel, a practiced, saccharine smile plastered on her face. Her eyes, however, darted from the man in the gray suit to me, sharp and suspicious. "Oh, hello. Can I help you?" she chirped, her voice several octaves too high. She stepped forward, physically inserting herself between me and Mr. Harrison, a subtle act of ownership. My mother-in-law gets a little confused sometimes. Any family business, you can run it through me. I handle all of her affairs. Mr. Harrison's gaze didn't waver from my face. He gave no indication he had even heard Jessica, though a muscle in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Thompson," he repeated, his tone unwavering. "May we speak privately? My instructions are quite specific." Jessica's smile tightened at the edges. "Well, that's highly unusual." "As I said, I have power of—" Mr. Harrison held up a single, calm hand, a gesture that was not aggressive, but carried the absolute weight of finality. It silenced her mid-sentence. For the first time, he turned his head slightly to acknowledge her, though his eyes were as cold as a winter sky. "My instructions," he said, the words now clipped and precise, are to speak with Mrs. Mia Thompson, alone. The terms of the trust are explicit on this point. The air crackled with a tension so thick I could taste it. Jessica's face, for a fleeting second, lost its composure. I saw a flash of raw, ugly panic in her eyes, a look of a predator whose prey had suddenly developed teeth. It was there and then gone, replaced by a mask of offended helpfulness. "Of course," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "If you think she's up to it, she tires so easily." She shot me a look, a clear warning. "Behave. Be the frail old woman." Mr. Harrison ignored her completely. His gaze returned to me, gentle now. "Mrs. Thompson, there is a small cafe, the Gilded Bean, just down the street. Would 10 minutes from now be acceptable? It would be my honor to buy you a cup of coffee." A cup of coffee. Outside. Away from the smell of gasoline and the weight of their constant scrutiny. It felt like being offered a trip to the moon. I looked past his shoulder, at the blue sky and the distant, snow-dusted peak of a mountain. Freedom. I found my voice, a little rusty, but it was mine. "Yes," I said. "Yes. That would be lovely." The word hung in the air, a small act of defiance. Jessica stared, her mouth a thin, hard line. Mr. Harrison simply nodded, a promise in his eyes. "I will meet you there," he said, before turning and walking away with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never lost an argument in his life. I closed the garage door, leaning against it for a moment, the solid thud of the latch a punctuation mark on a scene I didn't yet understand. But for the first time in a very long time, a crack of light had appeared in the gray walls of my world. The Gilded Bean was a world away from the garage. It smelled of dark roast coffee and toasted almonds, of warmth and life. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, and the low hum of conversation from other tables was a comforting blanket of normalcy. I hadn't been in a place like this in years. Jessica's prepaid debit card, with its humiliatingly small allowance, was enough for groceries, never for small luxuries, never for a life. Mr. Harrison was already there, seated at a small table in a quiet corner. A steaming cup of coffee was waiting for me. As I sat down, sinking into the plush chair, I felt a wave of self-consciousness. My clothes were clean, but worn, my hands chapped from the cold. I felt like an imposter in this cozy, civilized world. He seemed to sense my discomfort. "It's good to see you, Mia. I'm sorry it has been under these circumstances." I don't understand," I began, my hands trembling as I reached for the warm cup. "The Legacy Trust? David never mentioned it." Arthur Harrison steepled his fingers, his expression grave. "David was a complicated man. He was meticulous. He planned for every eventuality. The trust he established is the legal entity that controls his entire estate. The house, the stocks, the savings, everything." He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. He designed it like one of his architectural projects, full of load-bearing walls, hidden rooms, and a very, very specific foundation. He slid a leather-bound folder across the table. He didn't open it. "Mia, the purpose of my annual visit is to assess your well-being. The trust stipulates that the primary beneficiary, your son Leo, only inherits the full principal of the estate upon your passing, and only if a specific condition is met." I waited, my breath caught in my throat. "The condition," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "is that he, and by extension his family, must provide you with exemplary and dignified care in your later years." The words were so far removed from my reality that I almost laughed. Exemplary and dignified care. Was that what they called a cold garage and public humiliation? "They haven't," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I suspected as much," he said, his eyes full of a weary sadness. "Your isolation, my difficulty in reaching you directly, it all painted a picture. But Mia, this is where we encounter the first wall David built, or rather, a wall someone else has built in its place." He finally opened the folder. He turned it around and pushed a single document toward me. My eyes scanned the legalese, the dense paragraphs of text, but they snagged on the signature line at the bottom. It was my name, Mia Thompson, written in a shaky, uncertain hand that was a cruel parody of my own. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "It's a durable power of attorney," Harrison explained, his tone gentle but firm, like a doctor delivering a terrible diagnosis. "It was filed with the county court 6 months ago. It grants your daughter-in-law, Jessica, complete legal authority over your finances, your medical decisions, and your legal affairs. It essentially gives her the right to act as you." He pointed to a specific clause. "And it is predicated on this declaration, supposedly from you, that you are no longer mentally competent to manage your own life." The air left my lungs. The cheerful chatter of the cafe faded into a distant roar, mentally incompetent. The phrase was a branding iron, searing into my mind. It was the ultimate erasure. Not just a nuisance, not just a burden, but a non-person, an object to be managed. "I never signed this," I said, my voice shaking with a sudden cold fury. "This is not my signature. This is a lie." "I believe you, Mia," he said quietly. "It has all the hallmarks of a forgery, but it is a notarized document. A notary public has affixed their seal, attesting they witnessed you sign it." "That's impossible." "A corrupt notary, a friend, a lie. It's easier to accomplish than you think, especially when no one is looking," he said grimly. "And this, Mia, this is the first wall. It complicates things immensely. On paper, Jessica is you. She has the legal standing to control everything. To challenge this forgery, we would have to file a petition with the court. It would mean a competency hearing." He let the words hang there. A hearing, a public spectacle. Me on a stand, trying to prove I still had my own mind. "It would be a battle," he continued, spelling out the brutal reality. "It would be your word against a notarized legal document. It would likely involve court-appointed psychiatric evaluations. And Mia, it would almost certainly involve the testimony of your son, Leo." The word was a punch to the gut. I saw him in my mind's eye, standing in a courtroom, his face a mask of pained concern, coached by Jessica. "Yes, Your Honor, my mother. She's not the woman she once was. She gets confused. She imagines things. It would be my word against theirs. The word of a confused old woman against her loving, concerned family who held a legal document proving she wasn't sound of mind. They had built a perfect cage. And the key wasn't just a forgery. It was the love I still foolishly held for my son. The trust was meant to protect me, but Jessica's lie had turned it into the very instrument of my imprisonment. The coffee on the table had gone cold. The conversation with Mr. Harrison left me reeling. I walked back to the house, the crisp mountain air doing nothing to clear the fog of despair in my head. A competency hearing. My son testifying against me. They had thought of everything. The legal cage was seamless, its bars forged from lies and notarized seals. But there was one thing the law couldn't account for. One thing I had to believe still existed. A flicker of a conscience in my son. I found him in the kitchen, staring into the open refrigerator as if the contents held the answers to the universe. He was alone. It was a rare opportunity. Jessica was out, a spa appointment she'd announced loudly at breakfast, a small cruelty designed to highlight her life of leisure against my life of confinement. "Leo," I said. My voice was quiet, but it made him jump. He shut the refrigerator door, turning to face me. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. "Mom," he said, his tone wary, "you shouldn't be in here." "Jessica doesn't like." "I need to talk to you, Leo," I interrupted, my voice gaining a strength I didn't know I possessed. "Not as Jessica's mother-in-law, as your mother." He shifted his weight, his discomfort palpable. The sprawling gourmet kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances suddenly felt like a courtroom. "I remember when you were 10, I began, my voice softening. "You fell from the big oak tree in the backyard and broke your arm. You were so brave, you didn't cry until we got to the hospital. Your father was out of town on business, and you held my hand so tight. You said, "It's okay, Mom. We've got this. We, you and me." A flicker of something crossed his face. A memory. Guilt. It was there. I saw it. It was a tiny, fragile ember, but it was there. "What happened to us, Leo?" I pleaded, taking a hesitant step closer. "What happened to that boy? Your father, David. He wasn't always an easy man, you know that." "But he loved you. He built all of this." I gestured around the opulent room. "For you, for your future. Is this what he would have wanted? For his wife, for your mother, to be locked in a garage?" His eyes were filled with tears. He looked down at the expensive Italian tiles on the floor, anywhere but at me. "Mom, it's complicated," he mumbled. "Jessica, she just wants to make sure you're safe. The finances, it's all so complex." "The finances?" I said, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Is that what she told you? Is that what you tell yourself?" He looked up, his face a mess of shame and weakness. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. And for a second, he looked like that 10-year-old boy again, lost and in pain. She has everything so organized." My heart ached for him, for the man he was supposed to be. Maybe I could reach him. Maybe this was the crack in their fortress. "We can fix this, Leo," I said urgently, my hope surging. "Together. We just tell the truth. We tell Mr. Harrison. I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice was cold, sharp, and cut through the emotional tension like a shard of ice. Jessica stood in the doorway, her spa day apparently cut short. She wasn't holding a designer purse. She was holding a thin, manila file folder. Her face held no trace of the panicked woman from the garage. This was a different person entirely, composed, predatory, and utterly in control. She walked into the kitchen, her heels clicking ominously on the tile. She didn't look at Leo. Her eyes were locked on me. "A touching little scene," she said, her voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "A mother's desperate plea. It's a shame it's all based on a fantasy." She walked over to the gleaming kitchen island and placed the folder down between us with a soft thud that sounded like a gavel. "Leo, darling, why don't you go check on Chloe's streaming setup?" "I think her lighting is a little off," she said, dismissing him as one would a servant. He hesitated, looking from me to her, his face pale. "Now, Leo," she added, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous command. He scurried from the room without another word, the brief flicker of his conscience utterly extinguished by his fear of her. We were alone. "You think a little chat with my husband is going to change anything?" she sneered, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the folder. "You think this is about money or convenience? Oh, Mia. You are so much more naive than I thought." She opened the folder. It was filled with old bank statements, letters, brittle-looking financial records. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice a low, conspiratorial purr. "David was a complicated man, a pillar of the Aspen community, a financial genius, except when he wasn't." She slid a sheaf of papers across the island towards me. "Remember David's little Aspen Friends investment fund that collapsed back in 2019, right before he got sick? The one where he took money from all your dear, wealthy friends and lost every single penny in a disastrous tech venture?" The blood drained from my face. It was a secret I thought had been buried with him. A nightmare chapter I had forced myself to forget. David, in a rare moment of vulnerability, had confessed his failure to me, his reputation in tatters, facing ruin and humiliation. "He was going to be disgraced," Jessica continued, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "But you couldn't let that happen, could you? Not to the great David Thompson. So you did something creative." She pulled out another document. It was a record of a private jewelry sale. "You took the emerald necklace and the diamond earrings your mother left you, the ones you always said were meant for Chloe, and you sold them, quietly, for just enough cash to pay back every single one of David's investors before they could file a lawsuit." I stared at the papers, my hands trembling. She knew. How could she know? A noble act, in a way, Jessica mused, her voice a weapon. Protecting your husband's legacy. But the law has a less romantic name for it. It's called hiding assets from potential creditors. It's called fraud. You made him solvent so he could die with his reputation intact, while his real debtors got nothing. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. And your signature on that power of attorney? A forgery, you say. That's a serious crime. But so is what you did. You fight us on the competency hearing, Mia. And this, she tapped the folder again, this becomes public. The story of how the sainted Mia Thompson helped her husband commit fraud. The great David Thompson's legacy ruined forever by his own wife. His name dragged through the mud all over town. Is that what you want? Is it? It was checkmate. She had found the one secret I was desperate to protect, not for my own sake, but for his, for the memory of the man I had once loved, the father of my son. It was a mistake born of love and loyalty, a foolish act from my past. And now, it was a leash, pulled tight around my neck by the one person who had no right to even know it existed. The hope I had felt just moments before dissolved into a cold, black dread. She hadn't just built a cage. She had armed it with my own history. My secret meeting with Mr. Harrison, my failed appeal to Leo, the venomous checkmate from Jessica. It all swirled in my head, a vortex of despair. I felt utterly trapped, outmaneuvered at every turn. The forgery was a legal wall. The blackmail was a moral one. What else could there be? I called Mr. Harrison from a payphone near the grocery store, my hands shaking as I dropped the coins into the slot. The prepaid card Jessica gave me didn't have enough on it for a burner phone, but it had enough for a call. It felt like a clandestine operation from a spy movie, but the fear was nauseatingly real. Mia, are you all right? His voice was a lifeline of calm in my sea of panic. No, I choked out, leaning my forehead against the cold glass of the phone booth. She knows, Arthur. She knows about the jewelry, about paying back David's friends. I quickly recounted the scene in the kitchen, Jessica's triumphant reveal, Leo's spineless retreat. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy, weighted with a new layer of gravity. This is worse than I thought, Mia. Jessica is more resourceful and more ruthless than I anticipated. She's sealed off your two most obvious paths of attack, but I'm afraid that's not the end of it. There's one more obstacle. The biggest one. Bigger than blackmail and a forged legal document? I asked, a note of hysteria creeping into my voice. What could possibly be bigger than that? David, he said simply. The name silenced me. What do you mean, David? Meet me back at the cafe, he said. In an hour. There's something you need to see. The very heart of the trust document. An hour later, we were back at the same corner table at the Gilded Bean. This time, the smell of coffee felt cloying, the cheerful chatter of the other patrons an insult to my spiraling dread. Arthur didn't order anything. He had the large, leather-bound trust document open on the table in front of him. It was thick, hundreds of pages bound in blue, an imposing monolith of legal text. You told me the trust required Leo to provide exemplary care, I started. You said that was the condition. That is the primary condition, yes, he said, his finger tracing a line down a densely packed page. But David, as you know, never did anything simply. His paranoia was as much a part of him as his ambition. He didn't trust anyone, Mia, not his partners, not his friends. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, full of a sad understanding. Not even his own son. My heart clenched. It was a truth I had always known, but never wanted to admit. David loved Leo, but he never fully trusted him to be the strong, decisive man he wanted him to be. He saw Leo's weakness, his desire to please, long before I was willing to. This trust, Arthur continued, isn't a gift, Mia. It's a test, a final, posthumous examination of his son's character. I told you that evidence of neglect or abuse would void Leo's inheritance. That's true. But here's the cruelest clause of all. He turned the heavy document to face me and pointed to a specific, multi-part paragraph. I leaned in, my eyes struggling to focus on the cold, legal type. It stated in excruciatingly clear language that in the event the primary beneficiary, Leo, failed to meet the exemplary care clause, the entire principle of the David Thompson Legacy Trust, the house, the stocks, the art, every last penny, would not revert to me. It would not go to Chloe. It would be immediately and irrevocably liquidated, with the entire proceeds donated to a list of pre-selected international charities for stray animals. I read it again. And again. Stray animals. David had loved his dogs, it was true. But this was a statement, a final grand gesture of mistrust. He would rather his entire life's work be used to feed dogs in another hemisphere than fall into the hands of a son he deemed unworthy. "But Mom, that's my leverage, isn't it?" I said, a sliver of desperate hope piercing through the shock. "If I can prove the abuse, they lose everything. They'd have to listen to me." Arthur shook his head slowly, his expression grim. "And that, Mia, is where David's brilliant, paranoid mind has created the perfect trap for you, and the perfect cover for them. Look at the next subsection." I followed his finger. The text went on to grant the provisional trustee, the person with power of attorney for the primary caregiver, control over a significant portion of the trust's liquid assets for the express purpose of ongoing maintenance of the estate and caregiver. "Jessica," I whispered, the name tasting like poison. "Jessica," he affirmed. "By forging that power of attorney, she not only took legal control of you, she unlocked the trust's checkbook. The clause was meant to allow you, or a legitimate guardian, to access funds to care for yourself and the home. But in her hands, well, my preliminary review shows they've been bleeding it dry, Mia. Lavish maintenance expenses, consulting fees. The yacht, the parties, it's all being funded by the very trust that was meant to protect you." The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of such breathtaking, diabolical cleverness that I felt a wave of nausea. "And now, think it through from a judge's perspective," Arthur said, laying out the final, crushing blow. "You come to court. You, an elderly woman who has, on paper, declared herself mentally incompetent. You claim your loving son and his helpful wife, who are managing your vast and complex affairs, are abusing you. You claim they're forcing you to live in a garage and turning off the heat." He paused, letting me visualize the scene. "And their response?" he continued. "They will produce the forged power of attorney. They will express deep sorrow and concern for your declining mental state. They will say, 'Your Honor, my poor mother is confused. She's lashing out. She's having delusions. She's trying to spite the very family that is caring for her.' And the blackmail? The story about David's finances? They will frame it as proof of your vindictive nature, a desperate attempt to destroy your own husband's legacy out of bitterness. The exemplary care clause, the very thing David thought would protect you, becomes their greatest weapon. Your claims of abuse will be dismissed not as evidence of their cruelty, but as proof of your senility. They will argue that triggering the charity clause is your true, spiteful goal." He leaned back in his chair, the full, horrifying weight of the situation settling over the table. It was a perfect, self-sustaining loop. The trust was the lock. The forgery was the key. The blackmail was the guard at the door. And David's own mistrust was the architect of the entire prison. Every move I could make, every truth I could tell, had already been twisted into a weapon to be used against me, a confirmation of the lie they had created. Yeah, I wasn't just fighting Jessica and Leo, I was fighting the ghost of my own husband, and he had, from beyond the grave, left me completely and utterly defenseless. The apology was the first stone I laid in the foundation of my new prison, a structure of my own design this time. I found Jessica in the kitchen the next morning, scrolling through her phone at the marble island, a cup of steaming coffee untouched beside her. The air was thick with her smug satisfaction. Leo was nowhere to be seen, as usual. He had become a master of convenient absences. I kept my head down, my shoulders stooped, a perfect portrait of a broken woman. I shuffled my feet, my old slippers whispering against the polished floor. "Jessica," I began, my voice a dry, reedy thing I barely recognized. She didn't look up. just made a small, irritated noise, her thumb flicking aggressively across the screen. I wanted to apologize for yesterday, I said, the words tasting like acid and ash. With Mr. Harrison, I was confused. It's been difficult lately. My memory isn't what it used to be. That got her attention. She finally lowered the phone, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. It didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were chips of ice, calculating and cold. "Oh, Mom," she said, the word dripping with false sympathy. "It's okay. We know it's hard for you." She patted the stool next to her, an invitation that felt like a command. "We're just trying to protect you. That's all this is about." I sat, my hands trembling in my lap. I made sure she saw them tremble. "I know," I whispered. "You're right. I shouldn't have questioned you. Or Leo. You're doing what's best." Her smile widened. Victory. She had won. She took a sip of her coffee, her gaze fixed on me over the rim of the cup. "Exactly. And we've decided, for your own good, it's probably best if Mr. Harrison directs any future questions to me. Just to avoid any more confusion. We don't want you getting worked up over things you don't need to worry about." "Of course," I said, my gaze falling to the floor. "Whatever you think is best." She reached out and patted my hand, her touch brief and condescending, like one might pet a dog that has finally learned a trick. "Good. I'm glad we understand each other. Now Chloe's friends are coming over later. Do you think you could make your lemon drizzle cake? And maybe just stay in your room once they arrive. You know how teenagers can be. So loud." "Yes, of course," I repeated. A ghost in my own home. That's what they wanted. And a ghost is what I would become. I retreated, not just to the garage, but into myself. I became a phantom of compliance. I perfected the role of the defeated matriarch. I cooked their favorite meals they often let grow cold while they laughed at something on their phones. I cleaned the house, polishing away my own fingerprints until it was as if I'd never touched anything at all. I stayed in the garage, knitting or staring at the blank walls, my silence a blanket they eagerly wrapped themselves in. Their cruelty, once veiled by thin pretenses of concern, now flourished in the open. They grew bolder, their contempt for me a casual, everyday thing. "Did you see the new listing in the Emirates Hills?" Jessica would ask Leo over dinner, as I served them, my presence completely ignored. "Private pool, cinema room. Once we sell this old place, we'll be living like royalty." Leo, who once had the decency to look ashamed, now just nodded eagerly. "Chloe would love that. She could finally get that pony she wants." They spoke of my home, my life's anchor, as a pile of cash waiting to be claimed. They spoke of my death as a pending transaction. I would stand there holding a platter of food and listen to them plan their future on the ashes of mine. The garage grew colder. Some nights, I would hear the faint, metallic click of the thermostat being turned off remotely from an app on Jessica's phone. I would huddle under thin blankets, my breath pluming in the frigid air, the cold seeping into my bones. But it was a different kind of cold now. It wasn't the cold of despair. It was the cold of patience. The cold of a predator waiting in the long, dark grass. They thought they were breaking me. They had no idea they were forging me into a weapon. In the quiet hum of my self-imposed exile, I began to fight back. The war was not one of words, but of whispers and shadows. My arena was the silence they had condemned me to. Jessica's financial control was meant to be a leash, but even the tightest leashes have some slack. The prepaid debit card she reloaded each month with a pittance for essentials became my first tool. She tracked the large purchases, the ones made at local Aspen stores. She never thought to look for the small digital ones. One afternoon, while she and Chloe were out for a spa day, a ritual they performed with religious frequency, I used the library computer. My fingers, which they believed were too arthritic and clumsy for an iPad, moved with precision across the public keyboard. I ordered a body camera, no larger than a coat button, from an obscure online electronics depot. I paid for it with the prepaid card and had it shipped to a general delivery address at a small post office in a neighboring town. A week later, I took a bus, a journey that took 2 hours each way to retrieve a small, unassuming package. No one noticed my absence. I was invisible, after all. The camera became my third eye, a silent, unblinking witness. I sewed it into the lining of an old gray cardigan I wore constantly. It saw everything. I recorded the nights. The screen of a small, cheap thermometer I'd bought, its digital display glowing with single-digit numbers, while the main house remained a cozy 72 degrees. I recorded the soft, insidious click of the heating being shut off, a sound I could now hear in my sleep. I recorded their words. "She's just getting more and more pathetic," I recorded Jessica saying to Leo one evening, their voices floating through the thin door connecting the garage to the house. "Honestly, it'll be a mercy. For her and for us." "Just a little longer, Jess," Leo's voice, weak and placating. "Harrison's report is the last hurdle. Once that's done, we can move forward with the power of attorney and the sale." "He'd better not try to speak with her alone again," Jessica hissed. "I'll tell him her dementia is getting worse, that she's having paranoid delusions. Who is he going to believe? Us, her loving family, or a confused old woman who can't even remember what she had for breakfast?" I documented every syllable, every casual cruelty, every meticulously planned step of their betrayal. The video files were my ammunition. But ammunition is useless without a way to deliver it. My second purchase was a burner phone, bought with cash I'd been skimming for weeks. A few dollars here and there from the grocery money. It was a relic, a simple flip phone with no GPS, no internet, no connection to my life. It was my lifeline. My first call was to Mr. Harrison's office. I didn't speak to him directly. I spoke to his longtime paralegal, a discreet woman named Evelyn, whose loyalty was to the firm, not to my son's wife. "I need to send some documents to Mr. Harrison for the trust's annual review," I said, my voice low, speaking from the echoing quiet of a public park bathroom. "They are of a sensitive nature." "Can you provide a secure encrypted email address?" There was a pause. I could hear the faint clacking of a keyboard. Evelyn was a professional. She didn't ask questions. She simply provided the information. "The address is secure. The files will be routed directly to Mr. Harrison's private server. No one else will have access." That night, I returned to the library. Transferring the video files from the camera's micro SD card was a slow, painstaking process. I compressed them, encrypted them using a free software I'd taught myself to use, and sent them into the digital ether. Each sent file was a small act of rebellion, a quiet scream into the void that I knew, this time, would be heard. A day later, my burner phone buzzed. It was an encrypted text. "Files received. This is compelling, but circumstantial. Her claims of your cognitive decline will be pitted against this. We need something incontrovertible, something that undermines her legal standing entirely." Think, Mia. David was a man of patterns and contingencies. Is there anything he left? Anything he put in your name? Any private arrangement he might have made as a fail-safe? The trust is my domain, but your personal assets are your own. J.H. The message was a jolt. Mr. Harrison was bound by the law, a neutral arbiter of the trust. He couldn't be my advocate. But Arthur, the man who had known my husband for 40 years, was giving me a signpost. He was telling me where to look. Your personal assets are your own. He was right. David was a monster of control, but he was also a creature of habit, of meticulous, maddening precision. He lived his life through a series of codes, passwords, and hidden meanings. It was how he controlled his world, his business, his family. He had built a fortress of secrets around us, and I had been his most loyal prisoner. I spent days turning Mr. Harrison's words over in my mind, searching the archives of my memory. I thought about safety deposit boxes, old financial statements, offshore accounts. Nothing. Jessica, with her paralegal training, had been ruthlessly efficient in consolidating everything under her supposed power of attorney. She had found and locked down every asset tied to David's name. The clue came to me not in a flash of brilliance, but in a moment of quiet sorrow. I was in the garden, a place I hadn't tended to since David's death. It was overgrown, the rose bushes thorny and bare, the lavender choked by weeds. And there, in the corner, was his prized flower bed. It was a mess now, but I could still see the withered, blackened stalk of the single dahlia bush he had planted years ago. A black dahlia. An exotic, almost unnaturally dark flower. He had been obsessed with it. And then, a memory, a phantom whisper from years past. We were sitting on the patio, David swirling a glass of scotch, staring at that flower. He'd turned to me, a strange, knowing look in his eyes. "Now remember, Mia," he had said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Everything of value is hidden behind a dahlia." At the time, I'd dismissed it. Leo and Jessica, when I once mentioned it after his death, had laughed it off as one of his dementia-fueled fantasies from his final years, a symptom of his decline. But it wasn't. I knew David. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a code. That night, I waited. I waited until the house was silent, until the only light was the cold blue glow of the moon. I pulled on a pair of old gardening gloves, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I took a small hand trowel from the garden shed and crept to the corner of the yard. The ground was cold and hard. I knelt in the damp earth, the scent of decay and wet soil filling my lungs. I dug around the base of the dead dahlia stalk, my hands shaking, my breath catching with every scrape of metal against stone. For a moment, I felt a surge of despair. It was just a crazy old man's rambling. There was nothing here, and then I heard it. A dull thud, not a rock. It was a flat, hollow sound. I dug faster, my fingers clawing at the dirt. I uncovered the edge of a flat, metal box. It was a small, waterproof safe, rusted at the hinges but still solid. There was no keyhole, only a combination dial crusted with mud. The combination, another code. I thought back, frantically searching for numbers, birthdays, anniversaries, but it wasn't any of those. David was more sentimental about his secrets than his relationships. The dahlia. He had planted it on the day he closed his first major deal, the one that set up his entire empire. I remembered the date because he had made us celebrate it every year. October 2nd, 1985. 10:02:85. My fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the dial. Right to 10, left past it to 2, right to 85. I pulled on the handle. It didn't budge. My heart sank. Of course, it wouldn't be that simple. David loved layers. I tried again. His first deal, his first company. Its name was Apex Industries, APEX, on an old telephone keypad that would be 2 to 739. I tried the new combination. Nothing. I sat back on my heels, exhausted and close to tears. The moon was high in the sky. I was running out of time. What was I missing? Everything of value is hidden behind a dahlia. Not in it, not under it. Behind it. I looked at the code again. 10:02:85. His triumph. And what was his greatest fear? Failure. The deal that almost ruined him. The one I had to sell my own jewelry to cover. The secret Jessica was now using to blackmail me. That happened in 1994. The month was May. The 5th month. 05/1994. What if it wasn't one or the other? What if it was both? The triumph and the failure. The yin and yang of his entire life. With a final surge of adrenaline, I entered the two dates, one after the other. 10:02:85, then 05/1994. I pulled the handle. There was a deep, groaning click. The seal broke. The safe was open. Inside, protected by a sealed plastic bag, was not money. It was paper. Documents. My hands trembled as I lifted them out. The first was a sheaf of papers bound by a clip. It was a power of attorney document, notarized and official-looking, but it wasn't the one Jessica had. It was a different one, from years ago, one David had tried to get me to sign, granting him absolute control. At the bottom, where my signature should have been, the line was blank. I had refused. This was the proof that I had always resisted his control, that I had never willingly signed away my autonomy. But it was the document beneath it that made the air leave my lungs. It was thick, deckle-edged paper, cool to the touch. The header was clear, the font old and official. Deed of trust. I unfolded it. My eyes scanned the legal language, the property descriptions, the signatures, and then I saw it. The grantee section, the owner. It listed a single name. Mia Alistair. My maiden name. The date on the deed was from 1978, 2 years before I had even met David. The memory hit me like a physical blow. A small inheritance left to me by my great-aunt, a woman I adored. I had wanted a place of my own, a sanctuary. I had used every penny to buy this small house in Aspen, a town I'd fallen in love with on a ski trip. It was mine. When I met David, he was charming, powerful, and persuasive. "It's a smart tax move, my love," he had said a year into our marriage. "Let's put the house on a new deed with both our names. It protects us. It's just a formality." I, a young woman in love and unschooled in the ways of finance and deceit, had agreed. He had fabricated a new deed, the one Jessica and Leo now believed was real, but he had never filed it. He had kept the original. He had buried my independence in the backyard, hidden behind a flower. It wasn't a failsafe for me. It was his ultimate act of control, a final secret he held over me, a trump card he could play even from beyond the grave. But the card was no longer his, it was mine. I knelt there in the dirt, the cold forgotten, clutching the deed to my chest. This piece of paper was more than leverage. It was the truth. It was the key. Jessica's power of attorney, forged or not, was built on the premise that I was a co-owner of an asset with my son. That document was now meaningless. You cannot grant power over something you have no legal claim to. You cannot sell a house that was never yours. The game wasn't about proving their abuse anymore. It wasn't about the trust fund or their inheritance. This was about ownership. This was about dominion. They had tried to turn me into a ghost in my own home. They had no idea I was the landlord. A cold, quiet calm settled over me. The fear was gone, replaced by a crystalline, chilling clarity. I folded the papers, placed them back in the bag, and sealed the safe. I buried it again, patting the earth down over it, leaving no trace. The secret was back in the ground, but this time, it was my secret, my power. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my knees, and walked back to my cold garage, not as a victim, but as a queen, returning to her throne room to plan a public execution. They moved fast, faster than I thought possible. It was as if the universe itself was conspiring to reward their cruelty, to accelerate their escape from the life they shared with me. They found a cash buyer for the house, a name I heard whispered in their excited phone calls. Some tech mogul from California who saw Aspen as a status symbol, a mountain to be conquered and owned. He was willing to pay an obscene amount, a figure that made Jessica's voice quiver with a mixture of avarice and disbelief when she spoke of it. The closing was set at a prestigious downtown law firm, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows and lawyers who charged by the second. They were giddy. That's the only word for it. It was a feverish, almost manic joy. They moved through my house, the house David and I had built, not as residents but as victorious plunderers, pointing at furniture and art, deciding what to sell and what to discard. They were planning a life in Dubai, a fantasy woven from glossy magazines and influencer accounts. I'd hear them at night, their voices carrying from the main house into the frigid air of the garage. They talked of penthouses overlooking the Burj Khalifa, of desert safaris in luxury SUVs, of a life so detached from their current one that it might as well have been on another planet. It was a life built on my erasure. Leo, my son, bought a new Rolex. He didn't even wait for the sale to close. He put it on a credit card, confident in the imminent flood of cash. He posted a picture of it on Twitter, his wrist resting on the steering wheel of his car, the watch face gleaming. The caption was simple: "The future is bright." I saw it on the small, cracked screen of the burner phone Mr. Harrison had given me, a tiny window into the world they were so proud of, a world where I had no place. The day of the closing, they came to the garage. Jessica didn't even step inside. She stood at the threshold, her arms crossed, a cloud of expensive perfume fighting against the smell of gasoline and damp concrete. "We're leaving now, Mia," she said, her voice clinical. "The signing is this afternoon. We've told the lawyers you're unwell." It's better this way. No confusion. Leo stood behind her, shifting his weight, unable to meet my eyes. He was wearing a new suit, a bit too tight in the shoulders, the price tag practically still attached. "We'll send for you," he mumbled, the words hollow and meaningless. "Once we get settled in Dubai, we'll find a nice place for you. Stay in the garage," Jessica added, a final sharp command. "Don't touch anything in the house. The cleaners are coming tomorrow before the handover. We don't want them to be disturbed." Then they were gone. The sound of their car engine faded, leaving a silence that was heavier than any sound. They would send for me. The lie was so lazy, so utterly devoid of effort. It was more insulting than the cruelty itself. They believed I was nothing, a piece of furniture to be dealt with later, a loose end to be tied up from half a world away. I sat on the edge of the cot, the cold seeping into my bones, and I listened to the house settle. It was waiting. We were both waiting. I gave them an hour to drive downtown, to park their car, to ride the gleaming brass elevator up to the 20th floor, an hour to greet the buyer and his legal team, to sit at the long, polished mahogany table, their faces flushed with triumph. An hour to let their fantasy feel so real, so tangible, they could taste the champagne that would surely follow. Then I began my own preparations. I pushed aside the dusty tarps in the corner of the garage, revealing an old cedar chest David had used for his winter gear. Inside, wrapped in archival tissue paper, was a suit I hadn't worn in 20 years. A tailored, charcoal gray wool suit from a time when I was not a ghost in my own home, but a woman who commanded boardrooms and curated collections. It still fit. The fabric felt alien against my skin, a relic of a life I had almost forgotten. I changed out of the threadbare clothes they'd deemed suitable for me, the faint smell of mothballs clinging to the wool like a long dormant memory. I brushed my hair not into the loose, untidy bun of an old woman, but styled it as I used to. In the small, distorted reflection of a car's side mirror, I saw not the frail, defeated woman from the garage. I saw Mia. Mr. Harrison was waiting for me at the end of the driveway, as promised. He got out of his car, a classic, understated sedan, and held the door for me. He didn't offer pity or encouragement. He simply nodded, his expression one of quiet, professional resolve. "It's time, Mia," he said. The law firm's lobby was an atrium of marble and glass. The air was still and smelled of money. We didn't need to announce ourselves. Mr. Harrison was known here. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly as she saw me, but she simply pointed us toward a corridor. "The Thompson closing is in conference room C, Mr. Harrison. They're waiting for you." I realized then that they must have been expecting him, perhaps to finalize some detail of the trust. They were not, however, expecting me. I walked into that closing room, right as Jessica was reaching for a pen. The room was bathed in the bright afternoon sun, the snow-capped mountains, a perfect postcard backdrop. There were 6 people at the table, Leo and Jessica, beaming, a man in an expensive but casual sweater who must have been the tech mogul, and his 2 lawyers, all crisp shirts and serious expressions. A junior associate from the firm stood by with the stack of documents. The door clicked shut behind us. Every head turned. The change in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. It was as if the air had solidified. Jessica's hand froze mid-air, the smile on her face dissolving into a mask of pure confusion. Leo's jaw went slack. He stared at me as if he were seeing an apparition. He was looking at my suit, my hair, the woman he had tried so hard to forget. He was looking at his mother. I didn't say a word. I walked forward, the quiet clicks of my sensible heels, the only sound in the cavernous silence. Mr. Harrison was a step behind me, a silent, imposing guardian. I moved past Jessica, past my son, and stopped at the head of the table. My eyes met the buyer's lawyer, a man named Davies, whose face was a study in professional curiosity. With a slow, deliberate movement, I reached into the leather portfolio Mr. Harrison had handed me in the car. I pulled out a single, folded document. It was old, the paper thick and slightly yellowed with age. I placed it on the polished mahogany table. The sound it made was no louder than a sigh, but it echoed like a gunshot. Silence. Leo stared at the document, then back at me. Jessica's eyes darted from me to Mr. Harrison, her mind clearly racing, trying to compute this intrusion, this deviation from her perfect plan. The buyer's lawyer, Mr. Davies, was the first to react. He leaned forward, his professional instincts taking over. With a questioning glance at me, which I met with a steady, unblinking gaze, he picked up the document. He unfolded it carefully. His eyes, sharp and trained to scan for discrepancies, moved across the page. He read it once. Then he read it again, more slowly this time. A small frown line appeared between his eyebrows. He looked up, not at me, but directly at Jessica, whose smugness had now curdled into a tight, nervous anxiety. Mr. Davies cleared his throat. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Jessica, is it?" She nodded, a jerky, uncertain movement. "Yes, what is this? My mother-in-law is... She's not well. I don't know what she thinks she's doing here." Mr. Davies ignored her protest. He held up the document. "This appears to be the original property deed for the house at 145 Mountain Ridge Road. The title, free and clear." "Yes, of course," Jessica said, forcing a laugh. "We have our copy right here. The sale is perfectly legal." She gestured toward the stack of papers in front of her. Mr. Davies didn't even glance at them. His eyes were fixed on the paper in his hand. "The problem," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming even more precise, "is that according to this original deed, dated April 12, 1983, the sole registered owner of the property is a Ms. Mia Sterling." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. That name was later amended upon marriage to Mia Sterling Thompson. He finally looked up, his gaze sweeping from Jessica to Leo, before landing on me. "Your name," he said, now addressing Jessica directly, his voice stripped of all pleasantry, "is not on this deed. Your husband's name is not on this deed. According to this legally binding document, you have no authority to sell this property." Jessica's face went from smug to sheet white. It was a startling, horrifying transformation, the blood draining away to leave a pallid, waxy sheen. "What? No. That's impossible. It's a trick." Her voice was a shriek, thin and sharp in the stunned silence of the room. "David, my husband, he inherited it." "Leo is his heir." "I'm afraid not," Mr. Harrison said, speaking for the first time. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that filled the space, calm and implacable. "The property was purchased by Mia with a private inheritance from her own family, a year before she even married David. He lived there as her guest. She was always the sole owner." "She's senile," Jessica screeched, scrambling to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "She signed a power of attorney. I have it. She was declared incompetent. This is a fraud." She fumbled in her oversized designer handbag, her hands shaking as she searched for her phone, probably to call her own lawyer, the one who had helped her draft the forged documents. But as her fingers closed around her phone, another sound broke the tension. A sharp, electronic buzz. It came from the table, next to Leo's half-signed contract. His new Rolex glinted under the lights as his phone vibrated violently. He glanced down, his face a mask of confusion. At the same moment, across the room, Jessica's phone, now in her hand, buzzed with the same urgent notification. Then, a few seconds later, another buzz from Leo's phone, and another from Jessica's. It was a cascade of digital alerts, a rhythmic, relentless pulse. Leo picked up his phone. His eyes scanned the screen. The color drained from his face, mirroring his wife's. He looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. He held the phone out, his hand trembling. On the screen, in bold red letters, was a notification from his bank. "Alert! Account frozen." Jessica stared at her own screen, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. The same message, and then another, from a different bank, and a third, from their investment portfolio. "Account frozen. Account frozen. Account frozen." Mr. Harrison stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. He surveyed the scene, the stunned buyer, the confused lawyers, the shattered couple, with the detached air of a conductor concluding a symphony. His voice echoed in the tomb-like silence of the room. Pursuant to Clause 12.4 of the David Thompson Legacy Trust, he began, each word a perfectly placed stone, building a wall around them from which there was no escape. The primary condition for the beneficiary, Leo Thompson, to inherit is contingent upon the provision of exemplary and compassionate care for his mother, Mia Thompson, for the duration of her natural life. He paused, letting the words sink in. Over the past several months, he continued, incontrovertible evidence of gross neglect, emotional abuse, and financial exploitation has been collected and presented to the Trust's administrators. He gestured vaguely toward his briefcase. Video recordings, audio recordings, financial statements, and sworn testimony. The evidence is overwhelming. He looked directly at Leo, whose eyes were wide with a dawning, abject horror. As of 11 minutes ago, the trust was declared void. All associated accounts, including all checking, savings, and investment funds established by the late David Thompson for his son's benefit, are now locked, pending immediate liquidation. Jessica finally found her voice, a choked, desperate gasp. Liquidation? To where? Where is the money going? Mr. Harrison's expression did not change. It remained one of cold, hard legal fact. As stipulated in the Trust's secondary clause, in the event of a breach, the entirety of the estate's liquid assets are to be transferred to the designated charity. He checked his watch. A transfer that is, I believe, already in process. The Aspen Women's Shelter and a National Arts Endowment. David was very specific. Leo finally collapsed back into his chair, a puppet with its strings cut. He dropped his phone on the table. It clattered next to the useless pen. "But the house," Jessica whispered, her last vestige of hope. "The house is Mia's. We can't be." "Correct," Mr. Harrison affirmed. "The house is Mia's. It was never part of the trust. It was always hers." He then delivered the final, crushing blow, his voice as quiet and final as a closing tomb. "And for that reason, an officer of the court is on his way to Mia's residence at this very moment. He will be there to take possession on behalf of the legal owner and to ensure you can collect your personal belongings under his supervision. I believe you have 1 hour." The polished oak door clicked shut behind me, its sound a soft, definitive period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. The air outside the law firm was cool and sharp, a classic Aspen afternoon, but it felt different on my skin. It felt clean. For a moment, I just stood there on the pavement, letting the breeze move a strand of hair across my cheek. I didn't turn back. I could still hear the faint, muffled echo of Jessica's shrieking, a sound that had been reduced from a weapon to a pathetic, impotent wail. I could imagine Leo frozen in his chair, the color draining from his face as his entire world dissolved in a quiet, legal firestorm. But they were just echoes now, ghosts in a room I had already left. Mr. Harrison stood beside me, not speaking, his presence a silent, sturdy anchor in the sudden calm. He simply held the door of his car open for me. As I slid into the leather seat, I didn't look back at the building. I didn't need to. Their downfall was not my destination. It was simply a landmark I was now leaving in my rearview mirror. They were left with nothing. I knew the mechanics of it, the cold, swift procedures Mr. Harrison had set in motion. The house sale, canceled. The trust, voided. The bank accounts, frozen and already earmarked for a half-dozen charities David had selected with surgical precision decades ago. I pictured Jessica reaching for her phone to call a friend, to rage, to cry, only to find the line disconnected. I pictured Leo trying to use his platinum card to buy a drink at some bar downtown, only to have it declined with a quiet, final beep. They were left with the designer clothes on their backs, the expensive watches on their wrists, and an ocean of debt they had so gleefully accrued on credit cards they believed the trust would always cover. They had built a life on a foundation of sand, and the tide had just come in. I didn't watch them fall. I didn't stay to see the moving vans, or the foreclosure notices, or the public humiliation that would surely follow. To watch them would have been to remain tethered to them, and I was done with tethers. I just turned and walked away, my steps feeling lighter than they had in 46 years. We drove in silence for a few minutes. the city slipping by. Mr. Harrison pulled over in a quiet park overlooking the valley. He turned off the engine, and in the sudden quiet, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a simple cream-colored envelope. It was thin, unadorned. My name was written on the front in David's familiar sharp handwriting. "He left one last thing," Mr. Harrison said, his voice gentle. "Separate from the estate. A private account. He set it up the year you were married." I took the envelope. The paper was cool and smooth. Inside was a single bank card and a folded piece of notepaper. I unfolded it. 5 words, written in that same decisive ink. "For your escape," it read. I had to let out a breath, a long, slow sigh that felt like it came from the very bottom of my soul. David, the architect of my cage, the man who had so carefully clipped my wings and curated my life until it was an exhibit in his own personal museum. Even then, even from the very beginning, some part of him knew. He knew his control was a pressure cooker. He knew that one day, the pressure would become too much, and I would need a door. And in his own impossibly controlling way, he had built one for me. It wasn't an apology, it was a contingency plan. The final move in a game only he was playing. But it didn't matter what his motives were. A key is a key, no matter who forged it. I had my escape. I sold the Aspen house the very next day. I took the first offer, a lowball from a developer who wanted to tear it down. I didn't care. I didn't want a single dollar more than I needed to leave. The realtor walked me through for a final inspection. The garage was cold and empty. Chloe's room, once destined to be a streaming studio, was just a blank space with white walls. The living room, where I had been made to feel like a ghost, was silent. It was a house of echoes and hauntings, and I didn't need any of its ghosts. I left with a single suitcase, the same one I had arrived with all those years ago. I didn't take the art. I didn't take the furniture. I just took the small, framed photo of myself at 22, standing in front of my first curated gallery show, my eyes full of a future I had long since forgotten. I drove west. I drove until the jagged, imposing peaks of the Rockies softened into rolling hills, and the hills flattened into plains, and finally, the air began to smell of salt and rain. I didn't have a destination until I saw it, a small coastal town in Oregon, nestled between gray-green forests and the endless expanse of the Pacific. The sky was a soft, pearlescent white, the light gentle and diffused. It was the complete opposite of Aspen's harsh, brilliant sun. It was perfect. Here I opened a small gallery, not a grand, intimidating space, but a warm room with wooden floors and big windows that let in the misty coastal light. I don't sell priceless masterpieces. I sell seascapes from local artists, strange sculptures made of driftwood, and bright, abstract canvases. And I paint now. My God, I paint. Not for critics, not for status, not to fill a space on a wealthy man's wall. I paint for the sheer joy of it. My canvases are small and full of color, the deep, impossible blue of the ocean during a storm, the fiery orange of a sunset bleeding into the fog, the vibrant, shocking green of moss on an old cedar tree. My hands, which had grown so used to being idle, now feel alive again, stained with cerulean and cadmium yellow. Each brushstroke feels like a word I was never allowed to speak. Sometimes, late at night, when the gallery is quiet, I'll scroll through the internet. Curiosity is a strange, lingering habit. I see Chloe's new TikToks. They are rare. There are no more cruel pranks, no more mocking videos from the deck of a yacht. There's one of her in a cheap polyester uniform, standing behind the counter at a KFC, her face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the kitchen. Her smile is gone. Her eyes are tired. She doesn't post much anymore. I don't feel a surge of victory when I see it. There is no satisfaction. There is only a profound and quiet distance, as if I'm looking at a character from a book I read a long, long time ago. I didn't do it for revenge. Revenge is a poison you drink hoping someone else will die. It keeps you chained to the very people you want to escape. I did it for the woman in that old photograph, the one with bright eyes and a future she deserved to live. I did it to breathe. I did it to live. My name is Mia. And for the first time since I was 22 years old, I am free.